about solar landmines. Yeah, not a thing or two, about a thing or two, about a thing or two. Mansplaining is deciding you're gonna search for the truth. Mansplain me, baby. Mansplain. There can be no thinking that would be uncool.
Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name's Mark. I'll be your host for this week. And as always, I'm joined by Joe, an old friend from college. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Joe, this has been a year where the headlines have been full of stories about heat waves on the East Coast and in Europe, with people really suffering through the heat. And maybe that was the occasion for the story that caught my eye in Wired, the headline of which was, "Dimming the Sun Would Lower the Risks of El Nino." And that brought to mind a topic that I've been wondering about for a while. It's always been one of those ones that I thought maybe I'll ask about this on Mansplaining, and that is the topic of geoengineering. And for those who are not familiar with the term, geoengineering refers to the attempt to engineer the Earth's climate in order to deal with some sort of crisis. And particularly within the context of climate change, which we touched on a couple of times in this podcast. On the one hand, there's an argument to be made where it doesn't look like anyone's going to stop driving their cars. We can't even manage to shut down coal-fired power plants. So it seems unlikely that we're going to be able to, on a global scale, reduce emissions to a level where it's going to stop or reverse climate change. And so from that standpoint, maybe geoengineering is our last or possibly even our only hope. But it's kind of that tool that you're not sure that you should use. So I'm curious about it, and I'd like to learn more. So I set you off with the request that you look into the suggestions for geoengineering that are out there right now, what the proposals actually are, how feasible they might be, and now that you've dug into the details, whether you think geoengineering would actually do more harm than good. So I look forward to hearing what you learned.
Yeah, and I learned a lot, and I was, at the end of the last episode, kind of excited to get into this because it's something I've read about only sketchily, and I now have a pretty firm foundation of geoengineering, and I'm excited to tell you about it. So the one thing I don't need to tell our mansplaining audience about is the risks of climate change, because we've been there before. We visited this topic a few times already. But I want to start this episode with a few not fun facts about the climate situation we face now, kind of set the table for geoengineering. A 2021 study in the Lancet Planetary Health showed that 9.43% of global deaths can be attributed to extreme temperatures. That's about 5 million extra deaths every year. It goes without saying that the best way to mitigate the undeniable effects of climate change is for the world to collectively lower its carbon emissions within the parameters laid out in the 2015 Paris Agreement. And I'm going to keep coming back to that last thought I just put out there. We need to lower emissions. As of 2026, 194 nations are formal signatories of that agreement, and only 4 are not: Iran, Libya, Yemen, and yes, the United States.
The U.S., as always, marching in lockstep with Iran and Yemen.
Yep, with its ideological allies. It's the coalition of the unwilling. As you pointed out in your question, the world's major polluters are not fully committing to the targets set out in Paris. And this applies especially to the U.S., which not once but twice elected president a climate-denying dimwit who pulled us out of the Paris Accord. So I agree with the premise of your question, Mark, that it's going to be hard for the world to live up to its Paris commitments. It's tremendously expensive and it's politically difficult. Trying to persuade every nation and multinational corporation to stop using fossil fuels in the near term is a pipe dream. In that context, deliberately re-engineering the climate is seen as a highly controversial backup plan to shave the peak-off temperature rise while the world slowly and fitfully moves to clean energy. Americans have been trying to scientifically control the weather since at least the 1830s, when the U.S. Army hired a meteorologist to figure out whether humans could make it rain. In the 1890s, the U.S. Department of Agriculture tried to remediate drought conditions by developing a rain machine that detonated giant water balloons. I would have loved to see that experiment.
Yeah.
By the 1920s, the military had turned its attention to displacing fog to allow for tactical incursions. After World War II, initially to aid farmers, scientists at General Electric conducted the first cloud seeding experiments to induce rainfall. And those efforts were continued by the Army through the Vietnam War. Today, geoengineering means the large-scale, deliberate manipulation of the Earth's climate to counteract global warming. Two types have been proposed: solar radiation modification and carbon dioxide removal. And I'm going to explain both. But that's our acronym alert, Klaxon, which means that acronyms for all these geoengineering methods will be coming fast and furious for a while. So buckle in, folks. Solar radiation modification, or SRM, also known as solar geoengineering, refers to the technique of dimming the sun by artificially reflecting about 1 to 2% of sunlight away from the Earth. It comes in a few different flavors. The most researched method with the best chance of being implemented anytime soon is stratospheric aerosol injection, or SAI, which uses balloons or aircraft to disperse microscopic reflective particles like calcium carbonate, titanium dioxide, or sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, which is between 7 and 30 kilometers high, depending on whether you're at the poles or the equator. In 1974, U.S. and Soviet scientists first proposed SAI to maintain climate levels. As one study put it, quote, "The prospect of changing the Earth's albedo," and that's surface reflectivity, to reduce CO2-driven warming has been recognized since the 1960s based on cooling observed from volcanic eruptions and burning sulfur-bearing fuels, end quote.
Yes, in fact, I believe the most recent ice age, at least within Europe, was triggered by a volcanic eruption that
Yes.
sent so much ash into the atmosphere that it significantly cooled the Earth.
Yes, that's exactly right. And that's the next thing I wanted to say. SAI, this strategic aerosol injection, mimics volcanic winter, the cooling effect of major eruptions like the one at Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines in 1991, which, get this surprised me, it caused global temperatures to drop by about 0.5 degrees Celsius for about 2 years as the sulfates slowly dissipated. So one of the ironies here is that the burning of fossil fuels over the past 150 plus years injected tons of sulfur dioxide into the lower atmosphere, which reduced global average surface temperatures by about 0.66 degrees Celsius. As we develop cleaner energy sources and move away from fossil fuels, that smoggy coolant effect diminishes, which accelerates warming.
That's quite a double bind there, isn't it?
Yes.
Moving to cleaner energy actually makes climate change worse.
Yes. So the second most studied SRM method, solar radiation modification, in case you forgot, is called marine cloud brightening, or MCB, also known as cloud seeding, which proposes spraying fine sea salt particles into low-lying ocean clouds. The microscopic droplets, measuring about 1/700th the thickness of a human hair, act as an aerosol, attracting water vapor that creates dense white clouds that reflect more sunlight back into space. The effect is like so-called ship tracks generated when ship exhaust fumes unintentionally increase the reflectivity of clouds along their routes. Unlike SAI, which can only work globally, MCB can potentially be used regionally, which makes it easier to implement because it requires less international cooperation. China has been testing cloud seeding technologies for at least a decade. Testing has also been underway since at least 2011 in the US and Australia, and since 2024 in the heat-sensitive ecosystem of the Great Barrier Reef. From 2021 to 2023, the UK launched balloons that injected a few hundred grams of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. It's controversial. SAI field tests scheduled in Sweden in 2021 and in Alameda, California in 2024 were canceled by local officials due to public opposition. And as you read in Wired, Mark, a recent study used climate modeling to examine the prospect of using cloud seeding to dim the sun in the Pacific Ocean as a way of mitigating the effects of the El Niño Southern Oscillation, a periodic phenomenon that often leads to more extreme temperatures and weather events. The study showed that cloud seeding would have a significant impact, but there's also research suggesting that employing it in one place could lead to higher temperatures in other places. MCB's prospects might ultimately hinge on the performance of sprayer technologies that have yet to be perfected, meaning the technology is still in the testing stage and not yet ready for prime time. One article I read said this research was still in its infancy. As the El Niño Studies co-author, UC San Diego climate scientist Catherine Rickey put it, quote, "There's a lot of things we need to figure out from models before trying it in the real world," end quote.
And I can only imagine how complex those models would need to be in order to come anywhere close to successfully modeling the complexity of a global weather system. You're not going to get there with like some simple simulation. This would have to be enormously detailed and complex.
Yes, and after I lay out all the forms of geoengineering and put them all on the table, then we're going to talk more about the testing that's going on and how close or not close to fruition those tests are. But first, let me mention the third SRM method. So we're still talking about solar radiation modification, deflecting the sun's rays. And that third method is called cirrus cloud thinning, which reduces those wispy clouds that act as a heat blanket and trap greenhouse gases. It absorbs their infrared radiation by introducing tiny particles that enlarge the ice crystals in the cirrus clouds so that they fall out of the atmosphere. We don't have a lot of research on this method yet, only simulations that show conflicting results, so it's still far away from implementation. Another highly theoretical method would be to use massive arrays of strategically placed space mirrors as orbiting sunshades to intercept sunlight before it reaches the Earth. This was seriously considered by President George W. Bush's science advisors until they learned it would cost trillions to design and maintain and would take at least a quarter century to build at a global climate-altering scale. Finally, with SRM methods, here on Earth's surface, there are things we can do, like planting crops with more reflective leaves, installing white or blue roofs on buildings, and making land and sea cover changes. Those things might move the needle a little bit, especially to reduce the heat island effect in cities. But that's also very costly and impractical. In 2011, a Peruvian NGO whitewashed a small portion of an extinct glacier peak to help restore its melting ice. And I saw a photo of it. It was pretty freaky. It looked like an art exhibit. The other type of geoengineering under consideration right now is carbon dioxide removal, or CDR. I told you there would be a lot of acronyms in this episode. And that describes a range of techniques to extract greenhouse gases from the air. There are natural methods like ocean fertilization, which involves intentionally introducing nutrients like iron or nitrogen into the upper ocean to stimulate phytoplankton blooms, which absorb atmospheric CO2 through photosynthesis and then transfer it to the deeper ocean when they die and sink. There's afforestation, which is the planting of new trees on land that hasn't been forested recently to capture CO2 from the atmosphere through photosynthesis and then store it in the tree's biomass and soil. We can enhance ocean alkalinity by adding crushed minerals like lime to seawater to accelerate its natural ability to absorb and permanently store CO2 as dissolved bicarbonate. And there's macroalgae cultivation and artificial upwelling, which uses nutrient-rich deep ocean water to boost the growth of seaweed that naturally absorbs CO2 and then sequesters it when it sinks to the seafloor. Then there are more industrial methods like direct air capture that uses large fans and chemical reactions to suck CO2 directly from ambient air for permanent storage underground or reuse in products.
And you're going to hear a giant sucking sound.
Exactly. CDR strategies are more expensive than solar geoengineering, and like ongoing climate mitigation efforts, would take decades rather than months or years to make an impact. But unlike solar geoengineering, the huge upside of CDR is that it perfectly counteracts climate change with few to no side effects. And that teases the side effects that I'm going to tell you about shortly of the solar geoengineering. Implementing solar geoengineering in our lifetime is possible, and that's why I'm going to focus mostly on it from this point forward. Strategic aerosol injection and marine cloud brightening are expected to be technologically feasible within the next few decades. SAI is the farthest along. The research I've read suggests that after factoring in all the important variables, including cost, scalability, performance, and development time, which itself comprises research, modeling, manufacturing, and deployment, the most feasible scenario is to inject sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, which some folks believe can be operational well before mid-century. Besides its relative quickness to implement, SAI is also remarkably cheap compared to the estimated $275 trillion required to decarbonize the global economy by 2050. For example, SAI delivered by fleets of specialized aircraft that technically don't yet exist, with larger wingspans and engines powerful enough to reach the stratosphere, is estimated to cost in the tens of billions of dollars annually. A drop in the bucket compared to the trillions required for climate mitigation. SAI would also impact global temperatures much faster than the decades it would take for emission cuts and CDR. As with Mount Pinatubo's eruption, regular deployment of SAI could act as a solar umbrella, producing a measurable cooling effect within a year. But here's the catch. Once SAI is up and running, to achieve sustained cooling, it would have to be maintained for multiple decades, if not centuries. That's because the carbon we've already emitted since the industrial age began remains in the atmosphere for a very long time. Even if all carbon emissions ceased today, the carbon we've already produced will continue to warm the climate, and will therefore need to be remediated long into the future. Think about that for a second, Mark. Geoengineering's most viable solution is to simulate for hundreds of years the effect of continuous volcanic eruptions, a 24/7 Pompeii without the ash, or if you prefer, a nonstop controlled demo of the effects of the asteroid impact that killed the dinosaurs.
It does underscore the profound difficulty of that implementation, that it's not just us deciding to do it. It's not just our children or our grandchildren or our great-grandchildren deciding to do it. It's generation after generation after generation after generation
right.
that would be on board for maintaining the effort.
That's right.
And nothing can stand in the way of that. Not war, not disease, not
Yes.
famine, not depopulation. It would need to be continuous no matter what.
Yes. And now you're anticipating some of the cons of this technology, which I'm going to get to very shortly, but keep that thought because it's right on point. But first, I want to say that to further enhance its viability of strategic aerosol injection is that it's not the focus of the public sector alone. At least 2 private startups received funding in recent years. One has been using balloons to deliver sulfur dioxide gas to the stratosphere since 2022. A second reported last year that it had received $75 million in seed money to develop and test aircraft-based aerosol deployment. Large donors have also been getting involved. According to the Wikipedia page on solar geoengineering, as of 2025, 48% of research funding had come from philanthropy. Silicon Valley, including the rogues gallery of Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, Bill Gates, and Sam Altman, has also taken an interest in it. Groups like the Environmental Defense Fund, the Natural Resources Defense Council, and the Union of Concerned Scientists all support further research. I want to drill down on the risk-benefit calculus of geoengineering, for here the scientific consensus is mixed. Proponents of geoengineering argue that we're running out of time to fix the climate and that desperate times call for desperate measures. Inaction on climate change has its own grave risks that are already starting to manifest themselves in all the wildfires, droughts, and superstorms we've seen in recent years. Proponents also think the critics of geoengineering are being overly timid while the house is already on fire, and that solar geoengineering is the only thing that can save us from the catastrophic 3 degrees Celsius warming and sea level rise that is projected to happen as soon as the 2050s. At the same time, most experts agree that geoengineering is far from a perfect solution. I've already touched on a few benefits of SAI, but just to reiterate this, implemented successfully, the immediacy of its cooling effects could temporarily stabilize the downward spiral of climate change we find ourselves in now by buying the world a few decades to fully transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy as we scale up carbon removal. It could potentially avert the worst climate disasters in the short term, reducing the frequency and intensity of heat waves in vulnerable, poorer regions, slowing down the melting of the polar ice caps and the collapse of glaciers, and mitigating the sea level rise that's threatening many low-lying areas, including places in the U.S. like New Orleans, Miami, and my hometown of New York City. Smart geoengineering, where we figure out how, when, and where to do it, could act as an emergency brake to avoid the catastrophic climate tipping points that we've heard so much about. The reduction in heat-related infrastructure damage and human mortality brought about by geoengineering might significantly outweigh its direct costs. But if implemented, will solar geoengineering have unintended consequences? Yes, almost surely. For one thing, it doesn't remove CO2 from the air, and therefore does nothing to stop things like ocean acidification, where the world's oceans absorb 25% of the CO2 humans emit, a process that threatens marine ecosystems by lowering the pH of seawater. In fact, SAI might add to the acidification because all those sulfates we inject into the stratosphere will eventually come back down in the form of acid rain that alters the chemical balance of both land and water environments. In other words, geoengineering doesn't directly address the root causes of climate change or the warming effects of greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere, and could lead to what some experts call mitigation deterrence. That has serious implications around the concept of moral hazard. Moral hazard describes situations where the people taking on excessive risk are shielded from the resulting fallout because they know another party will bear the cost of any negative consequences. Climate experts wonder whether the prospect of a technological quick fix might lead to over-reliance on it and the consequent weakening of the political will required to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. For example, in years past, some right-wing politicians like Newt Gingrich promoted geoengineering as a substitute for reducing emissions. Today, President Trump promotes the continued overuse of fossil fuels. What might he do if he thought there were a magic bullet to curb climate change without ever having to move away from coal, oil, and gas?
Yeah, I certainly see that point, and I do not doubt that some politicians would make hay with any opportunity to pretend that no long-term mitigation is required. I just wonder what the critics are imagining to be the alternative, because there currently is no real will to reduce greenhouse emissions on the scale that they need to happen. In my mind, the only thing that would create that will is some large-scale heat disaster, and by then the situation would be so much worse. So it feels like there's an element of the perfect at war with the good to this, and that's a damaged metaphor because there's nothing about SAI that's good. It's just less bad.
Yes.
But I feel like the critics are imagining some future scenario in which we all join hands and agree to stop driving cars. And I do not believe that's going to happen. And so them saying, well, don't do the thing that might help a little bit because it's not going to solve the problem.
Yes.
Like the analogy that comes to my mind is a tourniquet, right? If there's a spurting wound, you put a tourniquet on that limb and you don't say, oh no, don't use the tourniquet. That's not going to solve the problem. You use the tourniquet to buy yourself time to solve the problem.
Yes.
That feels like the more realistic perspective.
Yes, I hear what you're saying. And in fairness, we're just about to launch into the many arguments that the critics make. So I'll be really interested if you still feel the same way after I get done. But just to tee this up, I think the critics' argument is that you don't want to make things inadvertently worse through these heroic efforts that spectacularly fail. Attention mansplaining listeners. If you want to engage with Mark and me, you have some options. One is to go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast, where you can leave a comment or question, check our sources, suggest topics for future episodes, or just like us, because who doesn't want to be liked? You can also reach us through whatever app you use to listen to this podcast by giving us a 5-star rating or writing a review of your favorite episode. Or you can call and leave us a message on our dedicated voicemail box, which is 206-486-4074. And did you know that you can now listen to full episodes of Mansplaining on YouTube and check out our podcast music on Spotify? Yep, it's true. Just type Mansplaining Podcast into the search bar on either platform and you'll find us. It's lonely in podcast land, and we welcome and appreciate any feedback you might want to share. Act now, and we'll throw in a set of Ginsu knives. Not really. Scaling geoengineering techniques to a planetary level is daunting in and of itself. Deploying millions of tons of aerosols or setting up thousands of massive plants for direct air capture requires an unprecedented level of effective and equitable global coordination, cooperation, and oversight. So I want to stay with this point because I think it's really important. At present, there's no international framework regulating who controls Earth's thermostat and how. It's a policy-making void that cries out for international governance. In 2023, Mexico banned solar geoengineering after a U.S. startup, and that sounds too official to call it a U.S. startup. It was really two dudes, and one of them had a mohawk. They released 2 balloons containing sulfur dioxide and helium over Baja California, which is Mexican territory, without the consent or the knowledge of the Mexican government. In the U.S., federal oversight is limited, and polling suggests that most Americans view solar geoengineering research negatively, though for wildly different reasons. Right-wingers because they think it's a nefarious plot to poison them, a la chemtrails.
Yeah, or turn them gay. Don't forget about that aspect of the chemtrail conspiracy thinking. Yeah.
And left-wingers because of knee-jerk NIMBYism. Another one of my pet peeves, as we discussed on an earlier episode of this podcast. As a result, several states have preemptively enacted bans on solar geoengineering. At the global level, it takes only one nation or one rogue billionaire unilaterally deploying these technologies to spark a geopolitical conflict if another country experiences a drought or crop failure that they blame on that action. We saw what happened when Elon Musk cut off Ukraine's access to Starlink satellites to conduct offensive operations against Russia in Crimea. If you think it's unlikely that a private actor would experiment with geoengineering, consider this piece of trivia from Columbia's climate school. And I quote, "Today in the U.S., anyone who wants to shoot aerosols into the sky simply needs to fill out a 1-page form for the Commerce Department and NOAA 10 days beforehand." End quote.
Yeah, and our crack federal government will be sure to review that document very carefully.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. If a company is raising shareholder funds to develop SAI technologies, there's going to be a great deal of pressure for them to at least test that, if not actually deploy it, because if they don't, then that investment is worthless. But
Yes.
it occurs to me that at the national level, it doesn't take a rogue state necessarily to go ahead and do something like this. It takes a country that feels like it's suffering from climate change.
Yes.
And that doesn't need to be the US or China or Russia. It could be India, for instance, where if monsoons just go crazy.
Yes.
And in that case, it's hard to imagine any sort of international apparatus that's going to be able to stop them if they feel that their people are dying or their crops are failing. And they're just going to do it.
Yes, I agree with you. And that's why I think that point I just made about the lack of international oversight and some coordinating mechanism is really important here and really something we need to worry about vis-a-vis solar geoengineering.
Well, if you think right-wingers hate chemtrails, they hate one world government talk even more.
Yes.
So any sort of, we have a government that is convened in Brussels and is going to tell you whether or not you can seed your clouds. That would stir up the voter base in like a bee's nest.
Absolutely right. So many critics of geoengineering are just cautious scientists who think proponents are essentially playing God with little regard for the consequences. They view these proposals as a giant distraction from the challenge of reducing global emissions. Reckless, half-baked ideas that are bound to backfire spectacularly. As I said a minute ago, now I'm going to put some meat on those bones. They argue that tinkering with Earth's complex climate systems could trigger unexpectedly severe or even irreversible ecological consequences in addition to the huge geopolitical risks that we outlined a minute ago. To give some examples, Injecting sulfur into the stratosphere could have potentially dangerous side effects like further depleting the ozone layer, which increases UV radiation exposure, or affecting photosynthesis and diminishing sunlight, which could lead to lower crop yields. One of the startups I referred to earlier, a company called Stardust, claims to have invented a unique particle that can be used for SAI without triggering ozone depletion and acid rain. I'm sure we'll hear more about that soon because that would be a game changer. Artificially reflecting sunlight doesn't perfectly simulate a cooler atmosphere. It risks disrupting weather patterns and regional monsoon cycles, potentially causing severe droughts and famines in places like sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia, which threatens food and water security for billions of people. There's your Indian example that you just gave. Some geoengineering proponents liken these fears about side effects to harping on the negative effects of chemotherapy without acknowledging that it's used to treat cancer. And that's my version of your analogy about the tourniquet. They point instead to a 2024 study that included a cost-benefit analysis indicating that the reduction in mortality from using SAI to cool the planet would be at least 10 times larger than the increase in mortality from known side effects of SAI, like air pollution and ozone loss. The long implementation timeline for solo geoengineering raises intergenerational equity concerns, which you also mentioned a few minutes ago, in that it commits future generations to a path that they didn't choose. And there's also a phenomenon that I read in every article about this that I studied for this episode. It's called termination shock. And it describes a situation where if a geoengineering technique were to be deployed and then halted abruptly due to, say, a mechanical failure or a war or political instability, all plausible scenarios, the suppressed warming would likely rebound rapidly, resulting in a spike in global temperatures of perhaps several degrees in just a decade, a rate of warming that ecosystems and human societies might not be able to survive. Of course, if we do nothing to mitigate climate change, we're headed to termination shock levels of warming anyway. But even without a termination shock, one country's unilateral deployment of geoengineering in an unbalanced way could trigger international tensions or even war, since the optimal climate for one country or region might lead to drought conditions for another. Because of risks like these, certain United Nations committees and major scientific bodies see geoengineering as nothing more than an emergency fallback rather than a replacement for global action on carbon reduction.
Yeah. But again, going back to my earlier comment, I just don't know how we would stop.
Yeah.
I don't know if you mentioned it or if I read it, but China's been working on, no, you mentioned it, that China's been working on cloud seeding for at least a decade.
Yes.
So who's going to tell China to stop?
Right.
If India feels like, or Indonesia, say, feels like sea level rise is an existential threat, who's going to go in and stop them from SAI within their region?
Yes.
And so I cannot imagine the feasibility. Like, are paratroopers going to be dropped over some third world country? Are cruise missiles are going to be sent in to eliminate some facility? Like, what is the scenario in which we stop a country that feels desperate from acting on that desperation?
Yeah, but even though you're speaking kind of toward the inevitability of geoengineering and kind of in a supportive way, the examples you're giving show the potential consequences of half-cocked geoengineering being done by countries without coordination. So it truly is a daunting problem. But I want to say something about a word I used a minute ago. I just used the word unbalanced to describe an adverse use of geoengineering. And I want to say more about what I mean by that, because this is another important point. Any successful use of SAI would need to be geographically balanced. If you inject particles into the atmosphere unevenly, like only in one hemisphere or only over the poles, you get lopsided climate implications like potentially drying out major farming regions, throwing off seasonal rains like the monsoons, or shifting global wind patterns, any or all of which might create severe drought in some places while causing freezing or flooding in others. You might also get a thermometer problem in which geoengineering efforts stabilize global average temperatures, but the average masks extreme regional differences where you're overcooling one region while overheating another. If SAI ever happens, it'll likely involve in injecting particles near the equator to allow wind currents to spread them evenly toward the polar regions. It might also mean injecting at multiple symmetrical latitudes, like plus and minus 15 degrees from the equator, to maintain the natural temperature difference between the equator and the poles. Scientists are still debating how to do this perfectly, but one thing's for sure, it'll require intense global cooperation. Without it, one country's or region's panacea could easily become another's disaster. At present, the climate science community seems to be split into two large factions. One group of scientists and countries has called for a moratorium on solar geoengineering testing and deployment until its risks are better understood. Other academics and climate organizations argue that greater testing is necessary to understand the full range of risks. One point everyone seems to agree on is that solar geoengineering is not considered a substitute for climate mitigation efforts. Most experts don't support its immediate use, but many do support accelerated R&D that helps us to understand its precise mechanisms and risks, so that if the world someday reaches that break glass apocalyptic moment of climate emergency, we have the data necessary to make an informed decision rather than acting out of desperation. I read one 2024 research paper that identified the problem with R&D efforts to date. Quote, research has progressed despite limited funding, but has lacked the scale, coordination, or linkage needed to realistically probe SRM's promise or risks, end quote. That same paper underscored a different danger. While the research, quote, shows the possibility that SRM, if appropriately deployed, can reduce near-term climate risks and bring large, widely distributed net benefits for people and the environment. The possibility of such benefits provides no guarantee they will be realized, since decisions will be made not by a global welfare maximizer, but by real political actors, end quote. For the technology to benefit everyone, those political actors will need to act in concert for the greater good, and that might be the scariest proposition of all, which, is what you've been saying the last couple comments you've made.
I 100% agree that something like this should not be implemented unless it's implemented with a holistic viewpoint where you're thinking about the impact not just locally but also globally,
Right.
and keeping a sharp eye out for unintended consequences. And I do not see any sort of apparatus that has the power to do that.
Yeah.
I'm not opposed to a one world government. It kind of sounds like a good idea to me.
Yeah.
But that is just anathema to some
Yes.
people within this country and probably in other parts of the world as well.
Yes.
And so, yeah, it's hard for me to imagine that.
I don't see that apparatus either, but I was just thinking to myself while you were saying that, in 1960, who would have seen an apparatus that would take astronauts to the moon? Like humans are capable of amazing things when they put their minds to it. So that's why we're even talking about this subject.
But circling back on the moratorium on testing, I cannot imagine how anyone would determine what the risks are if they're not allowed to perform any tests. Like, you would need incredible modeling, and I just don't believe that computer modeling is that accurate, particularly when you're talking about something as complex, as I mentioned before, as complex as the global climate.
Right.
And then the second, the effect of a moratorium on testing and research just means that if someone does just haul off and do it, then you're guaranteeing that they do it without any research behind it, without that insight, without understanding of the possible side effects. So in a way, it hopes that no one will do something, but if someone does do something, it guarantees that it's more likely to be extremely damaging on a global scale.
Yeah, I agree completely. And while I'm open in theory to the idea of a moratorium on deployment until risks are better understood, it just seems crazily self-defeating to put a moratorium on testing, right?
Yeah. We should be doing more testing, not less.
Yes.
And I suppose the thinking is if you test, it's like loading a gun. If you test something, eventually you're going to use it.
Yes.
And so they don't want us going down the road of testing because that makes it easier to deploy. But I just think it's kind of short-sighted in a way because ultimately the outcome is likely to be bad for everybody.
Yes, I think it's two things. The point you just made, if you're testing a gun, you're going to use it someday. But also in the testing of that gun, how many people are going to get shot accidentally, right?
True. Yeah, you're kind of testing the gun by firing it into a crowd.
That's right. Yeah. Because as you said, computer modeling can only do so much. If you want SAI to work, you're going to have to shoot it into the air and see what happens. And what's that going to do to the countries who are underneath that, you know? Last year, you asked me about whether we should reconsider nuclear energy to address climate change. And that's episode 111 for anyone who's interested. I think that discussion was analogous to this question. And upon reflection, my conclusion is pretty much the same. It seems obvious to me that in a warming world where so many nations are dragging their feet and every bit of remediation is desperately needed, exploring innovative solutions like next-gen nuclear energy and geoengineering gives us a potential additional tool in our climate action toolkit. If you think about it, climate change itself is a form of unintentional geoengineering. While the risks of deploying intentional geoengineering anytime soon outweigh its benefits, the risk to humanity of completely ignoring the technology may become too high at some point in the future. Writing in The Atlantic, Alexander C. Kaufman made another relevant analogy, and I'm quoting Kaufman here. Back in the early 2000s, many climate activists vocally opposed funding adaptation infrastructure, seawalls, raised streets, and other measures meant to mitigate the impacts of a changing climate. They argued that these undertakings would prove ineffective and worse, would remove the will to decrease emissions. More than 2 decades later, emissions are still rising, and the cost of adapting to climate change has increased by the billions each year. Now, virtually no serious people involved in climate policy still oppose adaptation funding, end quote. We may soon have the same experience with geoengineering.
Yeah. My sense is, and I've been hinting at it all along, is that geoengineering isn't ever anything that we need to like, but we might need to make our peace with it.
Yeah.
Because within the analogy you use, the toolkit that we can use to address climate change, it's not going to be just one thing. It's not going to be the climatic that we switch on and that solves everything.
Yeah.
It's going to be an array of solutions, and probably geoengineering has some place within that, at least within the first few decades.
Yeah. So I'm with you on that. And let me just put my conclusions out there and then we can discuss it. As I've said, the best case scenario is for the world to come together to reduce emissions without needing to resort to geoengineering. But that's hard to imagine right now while the US is run by a guy who campaigns successfully on drill baby drill. And that's why my best guess is that geoengineering will be employed, possibly as a last resort, only when the world's half-hearted efforts to stave off climate calamity prove insufficient. Contra Newt Gingrich, the latest UN report on climate change emphasizes how solar geoengineering is not a substitute for emissions reductions. Quote, there is a high agreement in the literature that for addressing climate change risks, SRM cannot be the main policy response to climate change and is at best a supplement to achieving sustained net zero or net negative CO2 emission levels globally, end quote. Whichever geoengineering methods prove to be the safest and most effective will likely be implemented in addition to, rather than instead of, decreasing carbon emissions. In short, geoengineering might help us delay, but can't and won't eliminate the need for all of us to do the slow, hard work of bringing net emissions down to zero. So, to your final question of whether it would do more harm than good, my response is, compared to what? In a world that's united in its determination to address climate change, a world that does not currently exist, implementing geoengineering as a shortcut might do more harm than good. But in the world we live in today, where nations are not meeting their commitments to cut emissions, we will probably have to roll the dice with geoengineering someday and then see what happens.
Yeah, I fundamentally agree with you on that. I think, like I said before, I don't think it's something that we have to like. It's definitely something we should be concerned about. But I don't see any likely future scenario in which it doesn't play at least a part in mitigation scenarios.
Yes.
Because if we don't do that, people are going to die sooner rather than later.
Yes.
And then decisions will be made from emotion instead of from
Yes.
calculation.
Yes.
And the outcome of that is likely to be bad.
Yeah. And as we said in the nuclear energy episode, the answer here is not an either or proposition. It's a both and proposition. We need everything. We need these geniuses and entrepreneurs to come to us, and governments funding basic R&D need to come at us from all angles with every possible solution. And that's the way we're going to find our way out of this catastrophe. So I think we came to ultimately the same conclusions, right? I mean, you were stating my conclusions like 20 minutes before I got to them, but yeah. We're on the same page on this one.
Yeah. This, to me, seems like something we hold our nose and we do it because the outcome of not doing it is likely to be worse.
Yeah.
It's not something that I'm like, oh, good, that solves everything. It solves nothing, but it lengthens the runway for the longer term solution.
Right.
And sorry to future generations who have to keep it going.
Yeah, well, just because they have to keep it going and it wasn't their decision doesn't mean it's not the right thing to do. Like, future generations are going to have to keep the United States going too. But the United States is a pretty damn good idea for a way to organize politics, so some things are worth preserving. Okay, I've got a question for you for next time.
Okay, I'm ready for it.
My question is about standardized testing. The ACT, the SAT, the state exams we took as kids and the kids are still taking today. This question is prompted by a recent New York Times article in which it was reported that New York City's most selective public high school, with 777 seats in its incoming class, offered places to only 21 Hispanic students and three Black students, based on the results of its own entrance exam, the Specialized High School Admissions Test. This, even though 62% of the city's public school population is Black or Hispanic. So my understanding is that standardized tests were designed as an objective way to spot a student's talent and potential regardless of her background. We like to talk about education as a pure meritocracy where hard work equals success, with standardized testing as the ultimate proof of that. But when we look closely at the data, we see something very different. So I'd like you, Mark, to give us a little history of standardized testing in the US and then answer this question. If it's truly supposed to measure talent and potential, then why is her family's zip code and her parents' income level the single biggest predictor of a high score?
Okay, yeah. And kind of inadvertently, this question hits close to home because I have always been uncomfortably aware of the fact that my success in life is closely linked to how good I was at tests. Like I was the king of standardized tests, and that served me so very, very well.
Yes.
But yeah, very, very interesting question, and I look forward to digging into it. So I will go off for 2 or 3 weeks to look into standardized tests and come back with an answer to Joe's question. While I'm out, our listeners can enjoy the warm weather and maybe reflect on what is making it so warm this summer and what perhaps we will need to inject into the atmosphere to make it a little bit less warm when it starts to become dangerous.
Yes.
And then we can all have some sun, slightly better tans when we reconvene. But until then, that was Joe, and this is Mark. And we'll talk to you soon.
Stay tuned for the toe-tapping mansplaining house band entry on this subject, and talk to you soon.
The planet she is toast, so why not make the most of this amazing opportunity? We're all gonna die, so why should I cry? It's better to step out with impunity. In all this climate change fearing, sometimes you gotta take a chance. Put aside all the geoengineering when the earth is this hot. I gotta dance. Oh, the focus on marine cloud brightening is very, very frightening. Let's leave Mother Nature unchecked. Oh, that cirrus cloud thinning has my head truly spinning. Isn't it time we change the subject? In all this climate change fearing, sometimes you gotta take a chance. Put aside all the geoengineering when the earth is this hot. I gotta dance. In those fancy V-neck pants, you're as hot as the weather. Is there still time to make romance in this hot house together? What the heck is aerosol injection? Is it a sexually transmitted infection? If it is, you can count me out. Can I make it any clearer? I don't care about your space mirror, but there's one thing I'll never doubt. In all this climate change fearing, sometimes you gotta take a chance. Put aside all the geoengineering when the earth is this hot. I gotta dance. The prospect of climate disaster makes me wanna dance faster.
Sexy guys do find new things to love.
Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Music composed and performed by the Mansplaining House Band. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we'll see you next time.
Best